Megan was used to living alone. Her small house on the outskirts of town was quiet, surrounded by thick woods that shielded her from the world. It was peaceful, the kind of solitude she'd long craved after a messy breakup. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the only sounds at night were the rustling of trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. But something felt off that night. She had just finished dinner and was settling in to watch a movie when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from upstairs. Megan paused, the remote hovering in her hand. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Houses made noises. The old wooden floors had their quirks. She tried to brush it off, focusing on the screen, but her ears were now tuned to every little sound. A few minutes passed, and then she heard it again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. A slow, creeping groan that echoed through the silent house. Megan's heart began to race. She lived alone. There shouldn't be anyone else in the house. She grabbed her phone, clutching it tightly as she stood up. The logical part of her mind tried to reason. Maybe a window was left open, and the wind was pushing something around. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. The windows were closed. She was sure of it. Megan took a deep breath, forcing herself to walk toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, her pulse quickening as she reached the bottom. She stood there, staring up into the darkness, willing herself to climb, to find the source of the noise. But she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the spot, a primal fear keeping her frozen. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on her chest. Then, breaking through the quiet, came another sound, this time, the distinct thud of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever was up there knew she was listening. Megan's hand trembled as she gripped her phone. She should call someone, but who? The police? And what would she say? That she heard noises in her own house? They'd think she was paranoid, maybe crazy. The footsteps stopped. Megan held her breath, straining to hear anything else, but the house was silent again. Her skin prickled with unease, every instinct screaming at her to leave, to run. But she couldn't. It was her home, her sanctuary. She couldn't just abandon it. Gathering every ounce of courage, Megan finally started up the stairs. She kept her back to the wall, her eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. As she reached the top, she noticed something odd. A faint, musty smell that hadn't been there before. It was coming from the spare bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see inside. Megan's heart pounded as she pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind her. She reached for the switch, but something stopped her. A shadow moved in the corner. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The figure was barely visible, a dark shape huddled in the far corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Her mind raced. Who could it be? How did they get in? "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, still and silent, as if waiting for something. Megan's fear turned to anger. This was her home. She wasn't going to let some intruder scare her out of it. She reached for the light switch, flipping it on with a sharp click. The room flooded with light, but it was empty. Megan blinked, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The corner where the figure had been was completely empty. No one was there. She could still feel the cold dread creeping up her spine, but there was nothing, no sign that anyone had ever been in the room. Confused, she stepped inside, her eyes scanning every inch of the space. The smell was stronger now, a mix of damp earth and something rotten. It seemed to be coming from the closet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated, then yanked it open. The closet was empty, but the smell hit her full force, making her gag. It was overwhelming, like something had died in there. Megan covered her mouth and nose, her eyes watering as she backed away. And then she saw it. In the back of the closet, hidden behind a row of hanging clothes, was a small wooden door. It was old, the wood warped and rotting, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Megan had lived in the house for months and had never noticed it before. Her curiosity battled with her fear. What was behind that door? It didn't make sense. There shouldn't be anything back there. The house was too small for any hidden rooms. She knelt down, pulling the clothes aside to get a better look. The door had no handle, just a simple latch that looked rusted shut. Megan hesitated for a moment before grabbing hold of it. With a grunt, she forced the latch open, the metal screeching in protest. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passage that led down into the unknown. The smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. Megan's heart raced as she peered into the darkness, trying to see what lay beyond. She knew she should stop. Whatever was down there, she didn't want to find out. But something compelled her forward, a morbid curiosity that wouldn't let her turn back. Megan crawled into the passage, the walls closing in around her as she descended. The air was thick, suffocating, and the smell made her eyes water. She could barely see, the only light coming from the dim glow behind her. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into the earth. Just as she was about to turn back, she reached the end. The passage opened up into a small, dark room. Megan hesitated at the threshold, fear gnawing at her insides, and then she saw it. In the center of the room, lying on the cold, damp floor, was a small, child-sized bed. The sheets were tattered and stained, the mattress sunken in the middle. But it wasn't the bed that made Megan's blood run cold. It was what was on it. A doll, old and filthy, with matted hair and a cracked porcelain face, lay sprawled on the bed. Its eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with an unsettling, lifelike gaze. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her mind racing. How could this be here? Who put it here? And then, in the silence of that dark room, she heard a voice. "Mama!" The word was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill down Megan's spine. She looked around, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty except for the doll. She turned to leave, her fear now overpowering her curiosity. But as she started to climb back up the passage, the door at the top slammed shut with a deafening bang. Megan froze, her blood turning to ice. She was trapped. Panic set in as she clawed at the walls, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But the passage was too narrow, the walls too smooth. She was stuck with no way out. And then she heard it again. "Mama!" The voice was closer now, almost right behind her. Megan didn't dare turn around. She knew, deep down, that whatever was in that room wasn't human. The air grew colder, and she could feel something brush against her back. A soft, cold hand touched her shoulder, and a shiver ran through her entire body. "Mama, where are you going?" Megan's scream echoed through the passage as the darkness closed in around her, and the last thing she saw was the doll, its lifeless eyes glinting in the faint light before everything went black. When the police arrived the next day, they found the house empty. There was no sign of Megan, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The closet door was shut, the old wooden door behind it hidden from view, and in the spare bedroom, on the small bed in the corner, sat an old, cracked doll, its porcelain face twisted into a chilling smile, waiting for its next mama. Was a quiet night, the kind that makes you feel uneasy even when nothing seems to be out of place. Jenna had just moved into her new apartment, a quaint one-bedroom unit in an older part of town. The building was old but had character. Thick wooden doors, creaky floors, and narrow hallways that twisted and turned in unexpected ways. Jenna wasn't one to be easily spooked. She enjoyed her own company and often found solace in the silence that came with living alone. But that night, something felt different. There was a chill in the air that the radiator couldn't seem to shake off, and the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jenna decided to settle in for the night. She turned off the lights, leaving only a small lamp on by her bed, and crawled under the covers. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone lightly rapping on wood. Tap, tap, tap. She froze, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. Jenna's mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe it was the wind? Perhaps the old building was just settling. She tried to dismiss it, but the sound continued, growing more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, Jenna slid out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone, the dim light from the screen providing little comfort. She crept toward the living room, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet amplifying her fear. As she reached the living room, the tapping stopped. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the curtains. Jenna held her breath, scanning the room for anything out of place. But everything looked normal. Just as she was about to turn and head back to bed, she heard it again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the window. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine as she slowly turned toward it. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of something or someone on the other side. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, and reached out to pull the curtains open. Her hands were trembling as she gripped the fabric. With one swift motion, she yanked them aside, revealing the window. There was nothing there. Jenna let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over her. She shook her head, feeling silly for getting so worked up. She was just about to turn away when she noticed something. On the outside of the window, near the bottom corner, there was a faint smudge. It looked like a handprint. Her breath caught in her throat. The handprint was small, like that of a child, and it was smeared across the glass as if someone had pressed their hand against it and slowly dragged it downward. Suddenly, the tapping resumed, but this time it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. Jenna's eyes widened in terror as she realized the sound was now coming from the closet door in her bedroom. Tap, tap, tap. She backed away slowly, her mind racing with fear. She wanted to run, to get out of the apartment as fast as she could, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The tapping continued, relentless, growing louder and more frantic. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Jenna bolted for the front door. She fumbled with the locks, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, she managed to wrench the door open and stumbled out into the hallway, slamming it shut behind her. She stood there, panting, her back pressed against the door. The hallway was empty, silent except for the sound of her ragged breathing. Jenna knew she couldn't stay in the apartment, not after what she had just experienced. She had to leave, find somewhere else to stay for the night. As she hurried down the stairs, she heard it one last time, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the building. Tap, tap, tap. The next morning, when Jenna returned to the apartment with a friend, they found the place exactly as she had left it. Nothing was out of place, and there were no signs of an intruder. But when they checked the window, the handprint was gone. Jenna moved out a week later. She never spoke of the incident again, but sometimes, late at night, she could still hear it. The faint sound of tapping just outside her window. Tap, tap, tap. It was a chilly autumn evening when Emma's parents decided to take a last-minute weekend trip, leaving her home alone in their old, creaky house. Emma was 17, independent, and used to spending time by herself, so she didn't think much of it. Besides, she had her schoolwork, Netflix, and some snacks to keep her company. The house was a century-old Victorian style, with all the quirks that came with it. Uneven floors, drafty windows, and a network of vents that carried sounds eerily well. As she settled into the living room, Emma wrapped herself in a blanket, put on her favorite horror movie, and began to relax. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the tree branches to scratch against the windows. An hour into her movie, Emma heard it, a faint, distant sound. She paused the film and listened. It was coming from the vents, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, she dismissed it as the wind, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." Emma froze. The voice was weak, trembling, as if whoever was speaking was in pain or afraid. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind creating strange sounds in the ducts, or perhaps a neighbor's voice carried over. but the words were too distinct. She stood up and walked slowly toward the vent in the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt down, pressing her ear against the cool metal. The voice came again, louder this time. "Please help me. I'm trapped." Emma's blood ran cold. The voice sounded desperate, almost pleading. She tried to swallow her fear. Could someone be stuck in the crawl space? She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, heading towards the basement door. The old wooden steps creaked under her weight as she descended into the dark, musty basement. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the steady hum of the boiler. She located the entrance to the crawl space, a small door in the corner of the basement. The door was old, the wood rotting in places, but it was secured with a rusty padlock. Emma fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking. When she finally managed to open it, she shone her flashlight inside. The crawl space was narrow, just big enough for someone to crawl through, and it was filled with cobwebs and debris. The smell of earth and mold was overpowering. She hesitated, but the voice called out again, more urgently this time. "I'm here. Please hurry." Emma took a deep breath and crawled inside, the damp earth pressing against her palms. The space was suffocatingly tight, and the further she went, the more claustrophobic she felt. The voice continued to guide her, growing louder and more frantic. Finally, she reached the end of the crawl space. There, huddled in a corner, was a small, pale figure. A young girl, no older than 8 or 9, with matted hair and wide, terrified eyes. She looked up at Emma, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been here so long. I didn't think anyone would find me." Emma reached out to the girl, her heart aching with sympathy. But as she did, something strange happened. The girl's expression shifted, her eyes darkening. Her lips curled into a smile that sent chills down Emma's spine. "You're the first one to come this far," the girl said, her voice now cold and mocking. "They all leave before they find me. But you're different." Before Emma could react, the girl lunged at her with inhuman speed, her small hands wrapping around Emma's throat. Emma tried to scream, but no sound came out. The girl's grip was unnaturally strong, her fingers like ice, and the air in the crawl space seemed to thicken, making it impossible for Emma to breathe. As the world around her began to fade, Emma's last thought was of the strange, whispering voice that had led her into this nightmare. Then, everything went black. The next morning, when Emma's parents returned, they found the house eerily quiet. The TV was still on in the living room. The blanket Emma had used was draped over the couch, but there was no sign of their daughter. It wasn't until they noticed the basement door ajar and the crawlspace lock broken that they realized something was terribly wrong. They called the police, who searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no trace of Emma. The only thing they found was a small handprint, smeared in dirt, on the wall of the crawlspace. Emma was never seen again, and the voice in the vents was never heard from either. But sometimes, late at night, if you listen very closely, you might just hear a faint whisper coming from the walls. "Help me, I'm trapped." Emma had always loved the old family home. It was nestled deep in the countryside, far away from the bustling city life she had left behind. The creaking floorboards, the worn-out wallpaper, and the dim lighting gave it a certain charm that modern houses just couldn't replicate. It was a place where she could escape the world and just be herself. One weekend, she decided to spend a few days alone there to unwind. The house, passed down through generations, was filled with memories and relics from the past. Her favorite spot was the living room, where a large, ancient mirror hung on the wall. It was a beautiful piece, though its glass was cloudy, distorting the reflection slightly. The first night was peaceful. Emma enjoyed a glass of wine by the fireplace, letting the crackling flames lull her into a state of relaxation. But as she was about to head to bed, she heard it, a knock at the front door. She paused, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The house was miles away from any neighbors, and she hadn't invited anyone over. A shiver ran down her spine. Ignoring the knock, she convinced herself it was just her imagination or perhaps the wind. But then it came again, more insistent this time. A loud, deliberate knock. Emma's heart raced as she approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing. No one was there. The front porch was empty, bathed in the pale light of the full moon. Confused, she opened the door slightly and called out into the night. No response, just the rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. She quickly shut and locked the door, a sense of unease settling over her. Back in the living room, she tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was nothing. But as she glanced at the mirror, she noticed something odd. In the reflection, there was a shadow behind her, but when she turned around, no one was there. Her heart pounded as she stared at the mirror. The shadowy figure didn't move, just stood there, watching her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The figure seemed to grow darker, more defined. It was a tall, thin man, his face obscured by the cloudy glass. Panic set in. Emma backed away from the mirror, but her reflection didn't follow. It stayed there, frozen, staring at the figure. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the fire in the hearth flickered violently before going out completely. The only light in the room now came from the moon outside, casting long, eerie shadows. The knock came again, but this time it was louder, more forceful, as if whatever was outside was demanding to be let in. Emma's mind raced. She had to get out. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her brother's number, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flickered, the battery suddenly draining to zero before the phone died in her hand. And then she heard it. A whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible, came from the mirror. The shadowy figure in the reflection moved closer, its hand reaching out towards her. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in." Emma's hands trembled as she stared at the figure. She could see it more clearly now. Its face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. The knock came again, this time from inside the house. Terror gripped her as she realized the sound was coming from the mirror. The figure's hand was now pressed against the glass, as if it was trying to push its way through. The whispers became screams, echoing through the room. Desperate, Emma grabbed the nearest object, a candlestick, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, pieces scattering across the floor. For a moment there was silence, but then the temperature in the room plummeted, her breath visible in the icy air. The shattered mirror pieces began to vibrate, and from the largest shard, the shadowy figure began to emerge. It crawled out, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Emma screamed, backing away as the figure stood to its full height. It was even taller and more terrifying in person, its eyes locked onto hers. The room was filled with the sound of knocking, now coming from every direction, as if the walls themselves were alive with it. The figure took a step towards her, its mouth opening to reveal a void of darkness. The whispers returned, now coming from all around her, a cacophony of voices pleading, demanding, and threatening all at once. In a final act of desperation, Emma ran towards the door, fumbling with the lock. She could feel the cold breath of the figure on her neck, its fingers brushing against her skin as she yanked the door open and fled into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, where she collapsed, gasping for breath. When she finally looked back, the house was dark and silent, the shadowy figure nowhere in sight. Emma never returned to the old family home. She sold it soon after, unable to shake the memory of that night. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she can still hear the knocking, a reminder of the unseen guest that had tried to break through. And she knows, deep down, that it's still waiting for someone to let it in. When Emma's parents left for a weekend getaway, she was excited to have the house to herself. At 17, she relished the idea of independence, even if it was just for a couple of days. The house was old, creaky, and full of character, but she had never been afraid of it before. The first night was uneventful. Emma spent it binge-watching horror movies, ironically, and chatting with friends. It wasn't until she was getting ready for bed that she first noticed the odd noise, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound. It was so quiet that she thought she had imagined it. She shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind outside or the old house settling. But as she lay in bed, trying to sleep, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to be coming from within the walls. Emma strained to hear, her heart beginning to race as the sound became clearer. It was as if someone or something was talking, but the words were indistinct, just on the edge of understanding. She bolted out of bed, turning on every light in her room. The whispering stopped. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the middle of the room, trying to convince herself it was nothing. She was alone, in her own home, with nothing to fear. The next day, she tried to forget about the whispers. She kept herself busy with chores, homework, and chatting with friends. The day passed without incident, and by evening, she had almost convinced herself it had been her imagination. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispering returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The The whispers seemed to be coming from behind her bed. She slowly turned, staring at the wall, her mind racing. And then she heard it clearly, her name, Emma. The voice was raspy, almost like a sigh. She jumped out of bed, her skin crawling. Every hair on her body stood on end as she backed away from the wall, her eyes wide with terror. The whispering continued, growing louder, as if whoever or whatever was in the walls was getting closer. Emma grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and called her parents. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. Panic surged through her. She tried to call a friend, but the line was dead. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping voices calling her name, pleading, begging. Emma could hear scratching now, as if nails were scraping against the wood, trying to claw their way out. She ran out of the room, down the stairs, and into the living room. But the whispers followed her, echoing through the halls, seeping through the walls. No matter where she went, she couldn't escape them. They were everywhere, closing in on her. In a desperate attempt to escape, she ran outside, barefoot and still in her pajamas, into the cool night air. The silence was deafening. The whispers were gone. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Emma stayed outside until dawn, too afraid to go back in. When her parents returned the next day, they found her on the porch, exhausted and shaking. She tried to explain what had happened, but they dismissed it as a nightmare, a figment of her imagination. But Emma knew what she had heard. The whispers were real, and they were still there waiting for her. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, more insistent than ever. This time she listened. Through the fear, she heard the message they were trying to convey, the desperate plea hidden within the whispers. We're trapped. Help us, Emma, please. She never slept in that house again. This story taps into the fear of being alone in a familiar place, only to discover that something is terribly wrong. The idea that the walls themselves could harbor a terrifying secret adds an unsettling, claustrophobic element to the narrative.